Welcome to the PowerPoint on middle childhood. So this is basically elementary school aged kids from age 5 to 11. So it's a huge range, and obviously there's a big difference between a kindergartner and a fifth grader. And like we have previously, we'll be dividing this PowerPoint into first physical development, then cognitive development, then social and emotional development. So as compared to growth during developmental stages on either side, toddler, preschool, or adolescence, growth during the elementary school years is more slow and steady. So you remember we talked about how in infancy and toddlerhood, it's more sized by months, and then kind of years. Things get even more spaced out in middle childhood. So you might have sizes like 6 to 8, right? So covering several years. And then, this is all happening before we see those dramatic growth spurts in adolescence. So middle childhood, less dramatic, more slow and steady. On average, boys are slightly taller and more muscular. And nearsightedness, also called myopia, is rising during middle childhood. And it often gets detected in middle childhood when vision tests begin. And we think it's increasing right now because of our increasing reliance on screens and looking at things close up is maybe leading to less strong vision for things at a distance. Malnutrition is more of a concern in developing countries than developed countries, and generally children are more resilient to nutrition at this age than they were in early childhood. So if they had kind of good nutrition up until age 5 or 6 and then go through a period of famine, their bodies can usually handle that more. Without as much detriment. However, if they had earlier malnutrition in infancy and early childhood, we can still be seeing basically social, cognitive, and physical deficits in the elementary school years. So, for example, a social deficit might be not being able to persist in frustrating tasks, or less likely to explore a new environment, less positive emotions or positive relations with others. An example of a cognitive deficit might be poor performance on memory tasks, or an example of a physical deficit might be lower energy level or shorter stature, although some of that could just be genetic too. So childhood obesity is becoming an increasing concern, and what you can see is that it's mostly a concern in developed countries. So Africa very low, Southeast Asia in the middle, and then Europe and North America much higher. So globally, obesity is more likely to occur in affluent countries. So developed countries tend to have overnutrition problems, too much food. But the interesting thing is that once you look within a country, such as within the United States, now developed within our country, the people who have the most money are the least obese, and the people who have less money are more obese. Obesity is more of an issue for low-income populations within a developed country like the US because of basically inexpensive fast food and less reliance on kind of whole foods, which people in developing countries might get straight from their land, but in our countries we would need to go to supermarkets for, and many people, as we know, live in food deserts where there's not kind of lots of fruits and vegetables available. So this graph clearly shows the rates of obesity going up for children in the United States, as with all adults. And of course, struggling with obesity, as we'll see in upcoming PowerPoints, increases the risk of many diseases. And it also puts you on a trajectory to struggle with being overweight and obese as you age. So approximately 80% of children who are overweight around the ages of 10 to 15 will be obese adults by the time they reach the age of 25. Weight is increasing for both boys and girls. However, I have seen research that says we've had some declines in body mass index recently, perhaps because of our focus on intervention and prevention around exercise and nutrition. The CATCH program is an example of a prevention intervention program to help reduce childhood obesity. It has some nice research behind it. Longitudinal studies have showed that even several years later, the positive effects of it were maintained. It targets grades 3 to 5. And what you can see from the top left there is that CATCH has a very kind of integrated approach. So it's not just a one and done lesson on exercise and eating well. It's in kind of redesigning PE programs to be more high energy, to increase physical activity levels. It's redesigning the cafeteria to have healthier food offered in the cafeteria. It's redesigning the classroom curriculum to help children identify and practice healthy eating and physical activity habits. It sends material home for families, and it also is infused into after-school programs. Middle childhood is a time when involvement in organized sports increases. Boys are more likely than girls to participate in sports, but there are increases for girls occurring worldwide. Of course, now we're in a battle between like screen time versus outdoor sports activities. But it's important to know that kids show some real gains here. They have better balance, strength, coordination, agility, reaction time. So that's a picture there of my son in elementary school playing flag football. And I always marveled, right, at his kind of agility and coordination and reaction time in that moment, because you could imagine if I was out there trying to do that, I would not look like that, right? So you're not peaking yet. That generally happens in late adolescence and early emerging adulthood, but you're showing some considerable gains. And then, an interesting thing is that a theme that will come up in this class is physical activity isn't just about physical development. It also is about cognitive development and social and emotional development. So, for example, for kids, their level of physical fitness is correlated with also their memory development, both how well they perform on memory tests and the size of their hippocampal volume. It's actually 12% bigger if you're more physically fit. So basically there's more than just physical health benefits for participating in exercise. So kids show great gains in fine motor skills during the elementary school years. So for example, their writing improves and becomes much smaller and neater. They can do things like zipping up jackets, squeezing shampoo bottles, cutting up food. And by the end of middle childhood, they are generally at adult levels for fine motor skills, although there's still room for improvement, even though gross motor skills aren't going to peak until later. And again, there's a wide range of performance in the fine motor area. So even though on average kids are generally increasing through elementary school years, some fourth graders are a lot better than other fourth graders at handwriting or drawing or manipulating things with their fingers. Okay, so for this iClicker question on obesity, globally, so this one is the rates of obesity are highest in the most affluent countries and lowest in the poorest countries. So the answer here is A. And for this iClicker, which of the following changes is the largest contributor to the increased rate of overweight and obese children? Right now we're understanding this to be A, dietary change. So it's an phenomenon of overnutrition, basically, in more affluent countries. So this is generally a time when around the world children enter school, and in developed countries that's pretty much the norm. In developing countries there's more variation with increasing school attendance, especially for girls who have in some countries have not been attending school historically. And so the similarities are that teachers are generally very committed to teaching students the differences are that some cultures emphasize education more than others. Some schooling includes more religious education. Some schooling has more of an emphasis on respect for teachers and elders, and obviously there can be a wide range of the quality of materials in the classroom. Also just a range in requirements around school uniforms and behavior. So for most of middle childhood, children are now in the concrete operational stage for Piaget's cognitive development theory. And so this means that kids are more logical. They can follow basic rules, like if nothing is added or taken away, the amount is the same. They might be able to use inductive logic to, for example, reason that every time they're around a cat, they get itchy and their eyes water. So maybe they could use logic to realize that they're allergic to cats, that a preschooler wouldn't be able to do. They show advances in conservation, which we learned about in early childhood, and we saw those kind of 7-year-olds doing a better job, right, on the conservation tasks. They also do a better job in classification, and now they can manage hierarchical classification, which you remember that preschoolers couldn't manage because it required basically reversibility. When you are doing hierarchical classification, you have to kind of move items from subcategories to supercategories, essentially, kind of in your mind, and that's too complex for preschoolers. But in elementary school, you would easily see a chart like this on the left and be able to kind of create categories of animals with a backbone, without a backbone. And I can remember Isaac at this age saying things like, well, sharks aren't mammals, they're fish because they don't give birth out of water. And then seriation, we're going to talk more about on the next slide, what that is. So again, kids have better manage of reversibility and also decline in centration or decentering. And so that helps them with the conservation tasks, that they can focus on more than one thing. This helps them even with tasks in school. They could be given several steps of a assignment at the same time, and they could remember them and kind of work through them in order or move back and forth as needed, because they can handle more information in their minds and don't just overfocus on one element. Okay, so seriation is the ability to put things in order from tallest to shortest, smallest to largest, best to worst. And preschoolers struggle with this more because it requires decentering, right? Holding a lot of information in your mind and kind of comparing it back and forth. And so if you asked a preschooler to put these numbers in order from smallest to biggest, 90, 300, or 8, they may, for example, get confused like around the 300 or the 90. They may put 300 before 90 because the 3 is smaller than the 9 and they are centering on the first number. A task that frequently happens during elementary school is to get kids to put their whole class in order, right, from shortest to tallest, and they can, handle doing that. As we're going to see, this also relates to social comparisons. Now, kids get more accurate at judging their ability to do something compared to the rest of the children around them. Okay, so returning to information processing in middle childhood. So remember, when we talk about information processing theory, we are generally talking about memory and attention. And so these both improve memory and attention in middle childhood as compared to early childhood. And it's for a number of reasons, but one factor is increased myelination in the brain, particularly in the corpus callosum, which is that band of whitish fibers that connect down kind of in between the hemispheres that connect the left and right hemisphere. And so this makes for more efficient use of both hemispheres of the brain. So kids also at this age get better at demonstrating what's called selective attention. And so they can, as we move through elementary school years, get better at kind of seeing their attention as something they have control over and that they can decide, what to attend to. There's dramatic differences between like a kindergartner, first grader, second grader compared to a third, fourth, fifth grader. And I noticed this just by volunteering in my kids' classrooms in elementary school years. Is there was a big need for parent volunteers in kindergarten, first and second grade, because it takes a village basically to keep kids to keep paying attention to their task, whether it's math center or reading time or whatever it is. You need an adult there to keep making them attend to the task. But by the time they get to third, fourth, fifth grade, there's much less of a need for other adults to support small group learning, because kids themselves are better at kind of seeing their attention as a resource that they can devote to the task. Kids in middle childhood also start to use memory strategies more spontaneously, and they can also just they can be more receptive to these ideas of using a memory strategy to remember things. So here's 3 key ones. Rehearsal is just where you say something over and over. So I remember Iris, even at 5.5, trying to memorize her 5-digit school lunch ID number so that when she went through the lunch line, she could get chocolate milk. And she kind of is just saying it over and over to herself, saying, I got to get this into my brain. Organization might be when you study something for an exam, you might have a note card, on a topic, or kids might have a note card, and you might remember there's 3 criteria. And so when I'm trying to remember what this is about, I remember there's 3 things, that organization helps me remember. Or if you're going to the grocery store without a list, you might be remembering something like, I need 3 items in the produce aisle, 2 items in the dairy aisle. And so when you're standing in the dairy aisle, you're thinking, okay, 2 items, right? That's using organization to remember. And then elaboration is memory by association. So, the famous, if you were a music player, every good boy does fine, all cows eat grass, to learn musical notes. Or when you're learning someone's name and you meet someone named Karen, and then you think, oh, I have an aunt named Karen. And so when I look at you, I'm going to think of my Aunt Karen, and that's how I'm going to remember your name. Or I remember my kids in elementary school, another example of elaboration, learning the states, the state abbreviations. Hi, I'm from Hawaii. Me, I'm me, and I'm from Maine, things like that. The last bit is just that the more kids know, the larger knowledge base they have, and then the easier it is to remember new information because they've already built some schemes. And so there were some interesting experiments with chess boards and chess players and kids who didn't play chess. And basically, if they arranged a chess board in a way that was reasonable for a chess game, then the chess players in elementary school could remember the pieces on the board much better than the kids who had never played chess before, because they already had a knowledge base about chess, and it made it easier for them to kind of file that information. But if the chess pieces were arranged in a more random way that wasn't reasonable for a game, then there was much less of a difference between the chess players and the kids who didn't play chess because they couldn't draw on their knowledge base. Okay, so let's just read through this example and figure out which of the 3 memory strategies it is. So this is an 8-year-old trying to remember a phone number. So say the number is 663-8854. Then what I do is say that my number starts with 663, same as my friend John's. So I won't have to remember that really. And then I would think I've got to remember 88. I'm 8 years old, so I can remember, say, my age 2 times. Then I say how old my brother is and how old he was last year. And that's how I would remember that phone number. So which one is that? Rehearsal, organization, or elaboration? It's elaboration. Okay, so let's read through this eye clicker. In middle childhood, children become more capable of focusing their attention on relevant information and disregarding what is irrelevant. This is called, and the answer is selective attention. Again, kids are more likely to, for example, be able to focus in on a teacher and ignore, what kids are doing around them. So now we've got a few slides on a topic related to attention and memory, and that's ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And generally when I do this iClicker in class about does someone in your immediate family have ADHD, I would say it's at least 25% of the class says yes. And so I wish we're not going to have an opportunity to discuss this as a large group in person. But I look for ways in online discussions on the middle childhood topic to compare or contrast your experiences with what I'm talking about in lecture. So here's the current DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, definition of ADHD. So it's that the child demonstrates symptoms of inattention, and we'll get to some examples of those, and or demonstrates some symptoms of hyperactivity or impulsivity, and we've got some examples coming, that it has to have started before age 12. You may be diagnosed after age 12, but we have to look back and say, you were showing these signs of inattention, impulsivity, or hyperactivity before age 12. We also need to see the symptoms in more than one setting. And this is how we account for it's not just, for example, the way your parents are parenting you that's making you look inattentive, or it's not just a mismatch with a teacher that's making you look inattentive or impulsive, but it seems to be across multiple settings. And then we also have to see that it's at the level that it's really impairing you, either your peer relationships, your academic work, or if you're in a workplace setting, kind of your occupational functioning. So when we look at these symptoms on the next couple slides, we're all going to be able to relate to those, but it only becomes problematic if it gets to the level that it's getting in the way of our functioning. So you can read through here the criteria for the inattentive type of ADHD, and you basically have to meet 6 or more of these. And so just some examples that I can highlight. It may seem like the child doesn't seem to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in their schoolwork, doesn't seem to be listening when they're spoken to, avoids or is reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort, like schoolwork or homework, even though they might, be willing to put sustained mental effort to things they enjoy, like, video games. Losing things that are necessary for tasks, school assignments, pencils, books, tools, often easily distracted by stimuli around them, seemingly kind of forgetful, has a difficult time following through and finishing tasks, seems to have projects kind of started everywhere that are incomplete. Overall, the inattentive type is sometimes harder to detect if it isn't accompanied with hyperactivity and impulsivity, because sometimes if a child is inattentive only, they're just kind of daydreamers and they're not really causing a lot of trouble for teachers, and so it may be underdiagnosed. Okay, so the hyperactivity impulsivity types that we can see often accompany inattention. It's unusual to have only hyperactivity, impulsivity, and not also inattention, but it's not unusual to have just inattention without the hyperactivity or impulsivity. But, hyperactivity is having a hard time sitting still, so kids in the classroom might be getting up every 5 minutes to sharpen their pencil or get a drink of water, fidgeting with their hands or feet, or squirming in their seat. Now we have kind of these fidget tools that teachers hate but might help kids. Can't sit still at the dinner table. Often seems to be running or climbing excessively in situations where it's not totally appropriate. Might have a difficult time playing quietly. It's often kind of on the go, seems to be driven by a motor, talks excessively. And then impulsivity is lack of effortful control, right? Doing things that haven't really been thought through, blurting out answers before questions without raising their hands, difficulty waiting their turn, interrupting. And these, as we could imagine, hyperactivity and impulsivity is more likely to get people's attention. And so this creates more disruption for teachers, for example. On average, if someone has the ADHD inattention type, then that's associated with struggling more in school and then not feeling so good about yourself, perhaps
due to academics or being criticized, by adults for forgetting things, struggling to kind of adapt and function as well, whether that's in a home environment, school setting, and then also perhaps at work, struggling as adults. And then people with more hyperactivity or impulsivity are more likely to act out in ways that maybe their peers reject them for, and perhaps are associated with risk-taking behaviors like driving that could also lead to injuries. So around the world, ADHD is on average at about 6%, although that really varies by country. In the US, we're around 10%. Diagnoses are definitely rising in the US, and they're higher in adolescents because some people aren't diagnosed until then. Some kind of researchers suggest that the prevalence, the actual incidence of ADHD isn't actually increasing, only diagnosis is increasing because we have more awareness and testing. We do see twice the likelihood of diagnosis in boys, yet only half the likelihood of diagnosis, as you can see from this graph, in Hispanic youth. ADHD is definitely controversial. It can be both overdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. Inattentive girls are particularly, as we've talked about, likely to be underdiagnosed. And children who are youngest in their grade are quite a bit more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. So 8.5% of children who are the youngest in their grade are likely to have ADHD, compared to just like 5.5% of kids who are the oldest in their grade. So age is definitely an important factor for people who are doing the assessments. Age at grade level is important to keep in mind. So ADHD and the experience of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, are correlated. Adverse childhood experiences are things like having parents go through a divorce, interparental conflict, having a parent be in prison, having a parent struggle with mental health issues, experiencing different forms of abuse. And you can see there that having one ACE puts kids at slightly higher likely, about close to 1.5 times the likelihood of getting an ADHD diagnosis. Once you have 2 ACEs, then that's closer to 2 times as likely. And once you have 3 ACEs, then we're getting closer to 3 times as likely. The biggest ACE predictors were mental illness of someone you were living with, most likely an adult, and parental or guardian incarceration. I find this very interesting to think about diagnoses and wondering how many times we're labeling someone with ADHD when it's really trauma. Or is it still ADHD if it's caused by trauma? I think that's something that we're trying to sort out. So there's multiple pathways for the causes of ADHD. And so it might be different for one kid compared to another. There is a lot of evidence for genetics. I think maybe close to 20 different genes have been identified. One in particular that's studied is the dopamine transmitter gene, is a dopamine transmitter gene, which is thought to interfere with dopamine and make it harder to inhibit behavior. I have always read there's about a 25% chance that if a child has ADHD, then their parents also have some sort of history of hyperactivity, impulsivity, or inattention. There is a higher concordance rate on monozygotic or identical twins compared to dizygotic or fraternal twins. Let's see, in terms of prenatal challenges or exposure to teratogens, we talked during prenatal development about nicotine. Other teratogens are Tylenol. Actually, kids who are exposed prenatally to Tylenol have a 33% greater likelihood. Those seem to be the ones with the strongest research. And then there's other things that could be happening with the mother during prenatal development, things like high blood pressure, obesity, hyperthyroidism, stress, and having a baby that's premature or low birth weight, like we have talked about earlier. Once a child is born, exposure to environmental toxins like lead, food dyes, and I'm not clear which ones those are, but some, pesticides, again, not exactly sure which ones, and air pollutants do show correlations. Diet, there's sort of little or mixed evidence for sugar or unhealthy diet as a cause, but it's more clear as a treatment that it could exacerbate the ADHD symptoms. And then lastly, whether a cause or a mechanism, kids with ADHD have in some ways could be thought of as having delayed executive functions, which we're going to talk more about here in a second. And, you know, it sort of makes sense. Impulsivity declines with age, and that's associated with executive functions. So it makes sense that some kids would just seem behind in executive functions, and then they get better at it as they get older, and they might even age out of ADHD. There is no correlation with IQ. So even though kids with ADHD may struggle academically, when they're tested on intelligence tests, there's no difference. Here's the big three for ADHD treatment, and really it's the first two are the big ones: behavioral therapies and medication, with less research on diet. So we're going to be talking through each of these. So researchers vary on whether or not they prioritize behavioral therapy and parent training over medication. I would say it's more common for kids to be medicated than for them to be receiving behavioral therapy and for their parents to be receiving training. Some researchers would say ideally we would try this first, therapies first, before we move on to medication, or at least do them both and not just medication only. Behavioral therapies and parent training often go hand in hand because behavioral therapies are teaching kids to change their behaviors, and parents are often the ones who are having to be trained in how to help their kids do that. And so this video that you're going to watch gives a real nice sense of what behavioral therapies look like and how parents might be involved in structuring that or setting them up. Medication is perhaps the most common treatment. A 2016 National Survey of Children's Health found that of the 6 million children in the US diagnosed with ADHD, about 62% of them were on medication currently. So in terms of effectiveness, the rates of efficacy rates, they range in the short term from like 70 to 90%, you know, so if we measured it over, like, for example, a 2-month period. However, we also know that discontinuation rates are high. So people often stop taking their meds because they don't like how it makes them feel. The most commonly reported side effects are decreased appetite, sleep problems, anxiety, or irritability. Some kids also report stomach aches, headaches, maybe some dizziness. Most of the time, side effects can be addressed by changing the dosage or the medication, which is why I really recommend working with a psychiatrist rather than a family doctor. So psychiatrists, remember, are medical doctors or MDs. They've been to medical school, but they focus on psychiatric medication just like this. And so they're really the experts in getting it dialed in. Of these three main treatment areas, behavioral therapies, medication, and diet, I'd say diet definitely has the least evidence and more mixed evidence and may not work for help everyone. But reducing sugar seems to help some symptoms. Avoiding food dyes, artificial colors, increasing things associated with the Mediterranean diet, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, and then supplementing with omega-3 fatty acid seems to be a promising, potentially helpful supplement. In terms of treatments that are inconclusive or don't have strong evidence right now, meditation-based therapy doesn't have enough and sort of conflicting evidence. Social skills training, while useful, doesn't help kids with academic success, or at least so far. Neurofeedback doesn't have, a popular choice, doesn't yet have documented effects. And exercise, a personal favorite for me, even though we're going to see it seems to help with executive functions, research-wise, it has been less clear as a treatment for kids with ADHD. It might help some, might not help others. It does seem to help with any co-occurring anxiety or depression, however, that comes with ADHD.
So executive functions is a relatively new area that we've been giving a lot more attention to in the last, decade or two. And so executive functions are kind of located in the frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex of the brain, and they're kind of the central processes that are used in how we organize or order our actions and behaviors. People often say it's like the CEO of the brain, right? How you manages your thoughts and behaviors, helps you use good judgment, helps you decide what to pay attention to. And if you've heard that kind of phrase, oh, well, your brain's not really fully developed until you're 25, that's executive functions. That's what is being referred to, that you don't have that kind of fully developed CEO in your brain until you're 25 years old. So you can see on the slide kind of general examples of executive function, right? Monitoring yourself, setting goals, being organized, self-regulation, all those kinds of tasks. And then other executive function kind of theorists and researchers have divided them into hot and cold. Hot being more associated with socio-emotional competence, kind of relationships with others, and cold executive functions being more with kind of cognitive competence, so your success in academic related tasks. And so you can see some examples of hot are related to impulsivity and emotional control and anticipating the consequences of your behavior and then deciding, not to, elbow your sister or something like that because it's going to lead to trouble. And then cold might be your ability to pay sustained attention, organize a task, remember things. And so in this cyclicker, I just ask you to reflect on how you are at hot and cold executive functions, whether you're good at one, both, or you struggle with both. So anecdotally, what I've noticed in talking with parents and teachers over the years, having both a son and a daughter, is that there's often things said like, well, your son is doing really well for a boy, right? Or, that schoolwork is pretty good for a boy. And even, for example, we noticed when my son graduated from elementary school that, the vast majority of the honors students getting kind of honors were girls, and only a couple of them were boys. And so that kind of creates this kind of perplexing question, like what's going on with boys, because they generally do just as well on IQ tests, right? There's not a lot of differences there. So why are they not doing as well in school? And so I've often had this question about, is there a difference in executive function? And so we went looking, and so far what we could find in the research is not a huge amount of support for that. As you've seen, executive function involves a lot of potential different elements. And so some studies show more advantages for females, others for males. But two themes would be that girls show higher effortful control. So for example, my husband noticed that just going from teaching or coaching boys with soccer to coaching girls with soccer, the girls had a whole lot better, easier time kind of controlling their behavior and were less likely to devolve into hitting each other with sticks, at soccer practice. So higher effortful control. And that in adulthood, we might see men who are consistently more impulsive, kind of showing impulsive, sensation-seeking, or risk-taking behavior are kind of the two differences. So I guess what I want to say is there's some evidence for difference, but it's not huge. There are now a lot of programs for elementary school and then also increasingly middle school around socio-emotional learning and development, and basically teaching, and actually this is in early childhood to teaching kids how to kind of regulate themselves, which is associated with executive function. And so the PATHS program is one such program that can be implemented by teachers or school counselors. And this can help both kids who have ADHD, but just kids in general. And it's, has specific aspects for younger kids, like kindergartners might learn motor control over their behaviors or how to give compliments, but fifth graders might learn how to work in teams to solve social problems. But there are a lot of programs like this, and many of them have kind of research effectiveness to say that they can improve kids' executive function. Okay, and so then there is also a nice body of research on the connection between exercise and executive function and memory. And so there were basically some meta-analyses that found that having a kind of aerobic exercise led to pretty significant kind of moderate to large gains in executive functions, and then kind of moderate effects for cognitive performance in general. And we can see that this is, research will say that this is both long-term and short-term. So there have been research studies that have basically randomly assigned one classroom to have kind of physical brain breaks throughout the day, throughout the whole year. And at the end of the year, researchers have found that kids score in classrooms that had more exercise integrated into the classroom scored higher on state achievement tests. And so that there can be long-term effects, and there's also short-term effects. So if you put kids through some tests of working memory or attention, and you do it before they've exercised, they don't do as well as if you have them exercise first and then kind of test them. And so this is, I think, a finding that we're going to see replicated as we get into adulthood too, and something important for us to keep in mind as we are studying and trying to kind of cram information from lots of different topics into our minds, that we often will do a better job kind of learning and remembering if we've gotten some exercise first. So the first intelligence tests, or IQ tests, were developed by Binet, and then they were revised here in the US by Terman at Stanford, and so then they were called the Stanford-Binet. And the original idea, the way that IQ was calculated, was that the people who developed the test would decide that if you got a certain score on the test, that was indicative of your mental age. And then that could be divided by your actual chronological age and multiplied by 100. So let's say a 6-year-old takes an IQ test and gets a mental age of 6. So then that means they're exactly average for their age, and they get an IQ of 100. 100 is always the perfectly average IQ. But if a 6-year-old takes an IQ test and scores a mental age of 8, then their IQ is 133. So that's significantly above average. Now, instead of using the Stanford-Binet, we use what are called the Wexler Scales. And we calculate it statistically, basically the deviation from the mean, and that replaces the mental or chronological age ratio. So 100 is still average, and if you, compared to your peers who are of your same age, are doing better than them on average, then you're going to have a score over 100, and it can vary how much, right? And if you're doing worse on average than your peers, then you're going to have a score below 100. And so IQ scores, like many things, vary according to the bell-shaped or normal curve. And so most people are around the central score of 100, and we have less people with really low IQ scores and really high IQ scores. So IQ and genetics, there is a fairly strong relationship between genetics and IQ, and we can see this here that monozygotic, by looking at this, is that monozygotic or identical twins raised apart in different environments actually have a similar correlation or concordance between their IQ, more so than fraternal twins or biological siblings or parents and biological children who have all been in the same environment. So that kind of tells us that genetics trumps environment. However, environment matters because you can see that monozygotic twins who are raised together have better IQ better agreement in their IQ than monozygotic twins reared apart. So that tells us that environment makes a difference as well. And then as we've talked about, it's important to know that there is a reaction range for IQ or intelligence. So again, maybe you have a range between possible range between 90 and 110, and if you are raised in a more impoverished environment, your IQ is going to be closer to 90, and if you're raised in a more enriched environment, your IQ is going to be closer to 110. So Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, I'm guessing that some of you have learned about this before because it's becoming kind of something that's increasingly popular to be talked about. In fact, my husband came home from a team building day one time at work. You know, he's an engineer, and was like, we learned about this idea that there's lots of different types of intelligence and you need them all to have a successful team, right? And I was like, is it Gardner? He's like, yeah, Gardner's multiple intelligences. So Gardner tried to go further and basically say IQ isn't just about your math, verbal, and spatial abilities. That's often what's tested in IQ tests. It's intelligence is bigger than that. And so Gardner came up with these 9 areas, but certainly there could be more than this. And so the first one is linguistic, right? Being good at language, maybe being bilingual or trilingual or multilingual, being able to pick up languages, or having good verbal abilities, right? Being able to be a oral presenter or to be able to be a fast reader. Musical, right? That one's fairly obvious. Logical, mathematical. So this one is more about algebra. So if you're good at the algebra kind of math, right? That's logical, mathematical. Or maybe the logic puzzles that come on, LSAT or the GRE. Spatial is spatial intelligence, right? How patterns or objects are laid out in space. So this could be navigation, right? So there are definitely people who could be in a city that they haven't been in before and kind of know which way to go, and others of us who really don't. I have a friend who's an engineer. Engineers are often famous for spatial intelligence. He says he's been with engineers at a conference in a building where there's no windows that they can see. They haven't ever been there before, and one engineer will say, let's head north, and everybody seems to know what direction that is. This might also come into play, spatial intelligence, in things like sports, right? When you're able to kind of see the overall pattern in a team and kind of know your part. I'm famously terrible at this. I once played on an intramural ultimate frisbee team, and they told me that I was basically running around like a chicken with my head cut off, destroying the whole pattern. Okay, bodily kinesthetic, right? That's being able to move your kind of mimic body movements and move your body in more complex ways. So there are those of you who could learn dances really fast, or learn kind of athletic activities, or go to a yoga and be able to kind of make it look pretty good in a short amount of time. And then there's those of us who that would be challenging. Intrapersonal and interpersonal, I wouldn't ask you to know the difference in, because they are a little bit hard to tease apart. But interpersonal is understanding your own feelings and behaviors, and interpersonal is doing that for others. And what I've noticed among my friends who are therapists is that some of us are better at understanding our own feelings, and if someone's like us, we can really get that. And then others of my therapist friends aren't actually that great at understanding their own feelings, but they're really good at understanding the feelings and behaviors of others. Naturalist, this is like being able to explain natural events and laws of nature, like about the rocks and the stars and animals, and not being like me and just making stuff up when my kids ask me those questions. And then existential, this is people who enjoy kind of thinking in abstract ways about philosophy, theology, can kind of handle that more kind of complex and abstract thinking. So I heard this in a student commencement speech a few years ago, and this quote by Albert Einstein, and I thought it was a perfect example of Gardner's multiple intelligences. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. So this slide on music and cognitive development emerged from a student question a number of years ago, just wondering kind of how does music influence IQ or cognitive development. And so this was a study of a little over like about 150 6-year-olds, and they were randomly assigned to one of 4 groups for a year: keyboard lessons, voice lessons, drama lessons, or no lessons. And the music groups, keyboard and voice, had larger increases in IQ over the year. But of course, everyone's went up because just attending school can raise your IQ on average. Performance in math, reading, writing, and science were all increased when music lessons were taken. And another research study found that just Chinese college students asked to memorize lists of words. Those who had musical abilities did better at that memorization than those without musical abilities. So hopefully you've been not only thinking about your own life as you listen to some of this material, but you're also maybe thinking about what's happening with your virtual child and how well they are doing in all of these areas of intelligence. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about bilingualism. So we are seeing more, because of our increasing global society and immigration, we're seeing increasing numbers of children and people who are bilingual. And there has often been a question, if you're going to learn 2 languages or multiple languages, is it better to master one and then learn the next one, which would be called sequential acquisition, or is it better to just learn them both at the same time, which is simultaneous acquisition? And basically, simultaneous acquisition has been shown to have better long-term benefits in terms of your ability to speak both languages well. But we have to imagine that in the short term, you might be mixing things up. You might show some delays in the early years. You might mix up syntax or word order, even though over the long term it has better results. And then you can also see from the graph here that if you want to sound like a native speaker, you generally have to start learning the language prior to age 7. You can still be fluent, but you may not be able to sound exactly like a native speaker. And then bilingualism is shown to have other cognitive benefits, basically what's called meta-linguistic skills. So kind of once you learn multiple languages, it gives you a better understanding of the basic structures of language in general. And kids who are bilingual in the long term have higher scores on things related to metacognition or abstract thinking, can think more complexly and flexibly. Okay, so here's a trickier eye clicker than I would ask you on a test, but which of the following types of intelligence is consistent with the understanding of self? And it's intra with an A, personal. Okay, so now we're moving into emotional and social development in elementary school age kids. Okay, so starting with emotional development, on average, the elementary school years are a happier stage of life than adolescents or adults. So elementary school kids report feeling happier. Now, obviously, there's a lot of years there. There can be a lot of ups and downs and a lot of variation between kids. Kids get also better at regulating their own emotions, right? More impulse control, not, acting out violently when they're angry, not having big meltdowns when they're upset. They also are less egocentric, so they can understand the emotions of others better. They understand that people might have different emotional experiences than them. As part of increased emotional understanding, they understand emotional ambivalence. So the best example I have of emotional ambivalence is this book that we read a lot to my kids called Double Dip Feelings. And so that's the idea that you can experience 2 emotions at the same time. So a child might be happy to move and have a bigger room, but also sad to leave their house. My husband still uses this term in just casual conversation. I have double-dipped feelings about that. And one thing that I have learned from that is that we often just ask kids about one emotion rather than asking if they have multiple emotions. And so, prior to a game, parents often say something like, "Are you excited for your game?" But instead we could say something like, "Are you excited or nervous or both?" And what I found is when I would give my kids the options of experiencing multiple emotions at the same time, they often said both. Emotional display is this idea that you learn that you can be experiencing one emotion but display in another. So you learn what's appropriate to display in that situation. So I put this picture of a boy opening up a book, and it looks from his face like he's not super excited about the book, but he might say, "Thank you for the book. This is great," right? So he might display one emotion even though he's feeling disappointed. I noticed, for example, my kids would fall down in Old Town, for example, and not show emotion because they were out in public. But if they fell down, in the backyard, they might, cry, right? Our kids, we often, at school, hold in our emotions, but then come home and kind of let them out. So we learn where it's appropriate to display emotions with who and when it's not. So this eye clicker just asks you to reflect on if you've already experienced a double dip feeling today. Maybe you've been both happy for your friend and jealous of them at the very same time. Okay, so self-concept becomes more complex as kids move through middle childhood. So younger children focus on more kind of concrete things like and external kind of features like I'm a girl, I have brown hair, blue eyes. Increasingly in middle childhood, their self-concept is tied to other people or groups, maybe how they behave with other people or what they're a part of. So they might say, I'm kind and helpful, I'm good at math, or I'm in 5th grade, I'm a Boy Scout, I play Little League. And then you remember that seriation, that kind of cognitive gain that kids have about being able to put things in order, because they don't just centrate on one part, they can focus on multiple aspects, now allows for more accurate social comparison. And so if you ask a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old who's the fastest runner, they will say me, and then they'll run and say, look how fast I can run. But if you ask a 4th grader, who's the fastest runner, they will maybe think carefully and they'll say, well, first it's Jacob, and then it's Samantha, and then it's David, and then it's me, right? So because now they think kind of more about other bits of information. They're also less egocentric. They're not just thinking of themselves. They can actually put things in order more logically. And so their social comparison gets more accurate. The downside of this is we're going to see is that their self-esteem takes a little bit of a hit, because this is when they realize that they actually aren't the best soccer player on the team. And I remember my kids having this experience of, wow, once we got into competitive soccer, they didn't get picked for the top team. And so suddenly they realized that they weren't number one. So self-esteem certainly gets talked about across cultures, but in more individualistic cultures that are focused more on the self, we have more emphasis on wanting kids to have high self-esteem. And it does, as we mentioned, decline a little bit because they get better at social comparison. They're more critical and more accurate in their self-appraisal. Girls do tend to report lower self-esteem earlier than boys. But also boys and girls report some differences by area. So girls report higher self-esteem on reading, school in general, and helping others. Boys report higher self-esteem on math, physical ability, and not surprisingly, physical appearance. There's lots of different influences on self-esteem. So certainly, the cultural beliefs about how important it is to value yourself. Generally, kids who are raised with authoritative parenting have higher self-esteem, or those who have kind of a positive or warm connection to parents. Kids who are more socially accepted by peers have higher self-esteem. And then genetics too plays a role. So monozygotic twins are more similar in self-esteem, kind of higher correlations than others. So this topic, adultification of Black girls, was something that I heard about and wanted to investigate a little bit more. So adultification is defined as how much adults perceive children as more adult-like than they actually are, or how much they treat them like adults. And so this was a little over 300 adults from different racial and ethnic backgrounds and different educational levels in the U.S. predominantly white, about 3/4, and more female than male, about 60% female. And they completed a questionnaire about their beliefs about children's development. And they were randomly assigned to a questionnaire that asked about their perception of Black girls or asked about their perception of white girls. And this scale was adapted from a scale on childhood innocence. And basically what the research found was that participants viewed Black girls collectively as more adult than white girls, and they perceived them as needing less protection and less nurturing than white girls, and perceived them to know more about adult topics and being more knowledgeable about sex than their white peers. And so you can see a snapshot of the data up there. Black girls need less nurturing, less protection, less support, less comfort, are more independent. Know more about adult topics, know more about sex. And so I think this is really important too, if as adults kind of working with kids to check ourselves and make sure that we are not inadvertently kind of inadvertently protecting some kids more than others based on the color of their skin, and how we could be really shortchanging Black girls. Okay, so as we get into elementary school, we see kids becoming more gender segregated in their play. I think it's like, over 90% of the time they are often playing with same gender peers, and as compared to early childhood and in adolescence. So basically this is where they are the most rigid in their gender segregation. And I used to feel like, we should try to discourage that. We should make them play with, boys and girls all together. But I have since kind of learned what the research says is that generally kids who are more successful socially are those that kind of adhere to this gender segregation. And so in some ways you just kind of have to go with it. But I remember watching this with my own kids. I remember, for example, when my son hit like 6 and a parent of a daughter or girl that he used to play with, and he always went to her birthday parties, called and said, I'm really sorry, but we're having a girls only birthday party this year, right? Because they were getting more segregated. And border work is just the teasing that boys and girls do to keep genders separate. So, boys have cooties and you love him and those kinds of things, right? That kind of idea of what's wrong with you. And I can certainly remember in 4th grade kind of going through a tough time with my girl peers and deciding to sit with the boys at lunch and then kind of getting penalized for that. It definitely didn't make me more popular. In traditional cultures, we see girls and boys more separate in their tasks. So girls are usually taking on kind of more household labor and childcare, and boys might be more taking on tasks related to, manual labor or kind of farm work. In developed countries, we also just see increasing kind of more stereotypical behavior and attitudes. So both boys and girls begin to think that boys are better at science and math and girls are better at reading and art. So talking more about family life, I hope you'll take this chance to watch the Revel video on guided participation and how basically adults scaffold children's learning in a variety of ways. This is like Vygotsky's scaffolding, right, across cultures. And during the elementary school years, kids get increasingly independent. So there's less kind of intensive parental kind of monitoring. You're not having to intervene with your toddler or your preschooler like, 3 times a minute. I thought of this as like the sweet spot for parenting, kind of the golden years essentially, because kids are capable of doing so much more for themselves, are less overstimulating, and yet we're not into all the dangerous, terrifying things that can happen in adolescence. So kids get better at getting themselves ready for school, making their lunch, doing chores, brushing their own teeth, washing their own hair, giving themselves a bath. You don't have to do that anymore. And then parents can give them more freedom. They might walk to school on their own, partway through elementary school, or they might have some periods of time where they're, kind of not so closely supervised. And at the same time, they might get more chores. And this is also a time of high sibling rivalry. And this is something we could talk a lot more about, but generally it's really common for siblings to fight at this age, especially when children are closer in age. Children generally fight less as they get into adolescence because they aren't with each other as much. So when my kids were this age, I estimated that they were fighting half the time. Felt like it was all the time. And now they generally just fight like when we go on vacation, because that's when they're together a whole bunch. So many of you, when I survey students, many students say that they experienced sibling rivalry, and obviously we can't judge our characters by how we treat our siblings, and I was a total tyrant. So it's normal to be a pretty terrible person with your sibling but still grow up to be a decent person in general. Okay, so when I do this in class, what I often hear is that most students experienced some sibling rivalry if they had a sibling, and then we hear from people who really got along well with their sibling, and these are often siblings that were either quite a few years apart, and so one was almost more like a parental figure, or sometimes it's twins who didn't fight much and were really kind of connected. Okay, so family structure has always been more diverse than we have realized in U.S. history. So lots of times people haven't been living in two-parent biological families because there was often, children who were in orphanages or parents who died and then remarried. But we do know that family tends to be becoming increasingly diverse. You can see there 60-something% of kids live with two parents. We're seeing an increase in single parents. The divorce rates are still high in the US, but they haven't actually really been rising for several decades. So they're not going up. And so the increase in single parents is from parents not being married when they have a child, not from being divorced. That's still a factor, but it's not an increasing factor. And so what the research says about divorce is that it does increase your risk of emotional or behavioral problems. Externalizing behaviors like getting into trouble at school or at home, or internalizing problems like depression, anxiety, phobias, sleep disturbances. But what it says is that basically 25% of kids who have gone through a divorce experience some significant emotional or behavioral problems, but 75% don't. And that's compared with about 10% of kids from non-divorced families experiencing those problems and 90% not. So divorce does more than double your risk of experiencing something challenging as a child, but we also have to remember that most kids from divorced homes don't experience something really disruptive. Generally, more problems are during the first couple of years following a divorce. We also want to keep in mind that 40% of kids from divorced families are doing better academically than children from non-divorced families. And I bet you can think of examples like that of people who are from a divorced family who are doing better than people who are from a non-divorced family. In terms of step families, this has mixed effects on the kind of development of kids. So on the one hand, having another parent in the home brings more financial benefits, and money is always good for kids. It brings more support for the biological parent, and so parents who have more social support generally are better parents. Yet at the same time, it brings more conflict, especially when children are older, and it generally takes years for kids to adjust, especially if they're older, to a step parent. It's not just a months kind of thing. And it can be particularly challenging to form a step family with adolescents. And a famous model that has emerged around step parents, which is still applicable today, but not to everyone, is called the Babysitter Model. A lot of times what happens in step families is that the parent tries to be too much of the step parent tries to be too much of a parent, and then that creates conflict because the kids are saying, you're not my real mom, you're not my real dad, you can't tell me what to do. Sometimes the step parent's just taking this on because they don't think the other parent is strict enough, and sometimes the biological parent is just exhausted and wants the step parent to take on more of a parental role. But what the babysitter model says is it's better for the step parent to think of themselves, especially with older kids, and initially as the babysitter. So instead of saying, you can't watch video until you've done your homework, the step parent would say, I think your mom said that you're not supposed to watch video until you've done your homework. And if you're not sure on that, feel free to give her a call. And it should be rather than kind of this united front between step parent and biological parent, it should be the biological parent on the front line, with the step parent kind of behind the scenes supporting the biological parent, but not always kind of laying down the law. Now, again, that doesn't work for everyone, but what I've heard from a lot of students is that they wish their step parent had taken more of a babysitter role rather than trying to be an active parent. So this slide just tells us that we don't have the highest divorce rates in the world, but we have some of the highest. So the Scandinavian countries beat us out. And again, our rates aren't continuing to go up, but they're still high. In terms of friendship, as kids move through middle childhood, they get more selective about who they are friends with. They form kind of smaller groups of friends who have similarities to them, whether that's gender or sociability or activities or academics. And they definitely do things that are shared activities, like we ride our skateboards together. But they also will play kind of games that have really complex rules. So those of you who've been with kids on the playground, they can make up these amazing games with complex rules. And they also start to expect more trust and loyalty. And so they can feel more betrayed by friends at this age who, aren't standing up for them or aren't kind of taking their side. So that will become, much less common in kindergarten, first, second grade, but by the time we get to third, fourth, fifth grade, kids can have strong sense of injustice if their friends aren't kind of behaving the way they want them to. Okay, so there's a whole field of peer acceptance and social status research. And so what these studies would look like is they would go into, for example, the fourth grade class or fourth grade classes in an elementary school, and they would ask all the kids in fourth grade to make two lists, one of the kids that they really like to be with and one of the kids that they don't like to be with. And then the researchers would compile all these lists to then figure out for each child which category they fit in. And so the kids who show up on lots of people's lists that they like to be with this kid are the popular kids. And this isn't popular like we think about the popular crowd necessarily. These are kids that are well liked, and these kids generally have good social skills. They are more friendly and cooperative. And then there's the kids who show up on a lot of kids' lists of like, I don't like to hang out or play or be with so-and-so. And these are the rejected kids, and they tend to be either rejected aggressive. So these are the rejected aggressive kids are kind of the ones that can look more bullying, more impulsive, disruptive, right? Hard to work with in a group, getting into trouble. And then the rejected withdrawn kids are the ones who are more risk for being bullied. They come across as more passive, more awkward, more immature. And some of us could have been these kids, right, during elementary school. So that would be a normal experience. And then there's neglected kids who don't really show up on anybody's list. They seem kind of invisible. They come across as more withdrawn, they hang back, but when researchers look more objectively at their social skills, they actually have decent social skills. They kind of just underestimate themselves. Then there's the controversial kids who show up on both some kind of lists I like to be with them and other lists I don't like to be with them. And then the average kids are basically whoever is left over. Okay, so how does peer acceptance and social status relate to bullying? As I mentioned, bullies are more likely to be rejective, aggressive kids or popular and controversial kids. So we have had this perception that bullies were kind of the more disruptive, aggressive kids, but research is now suggesting that at least 50% of bullies are what are called socially connected bullies, and they are basically using coercive strategies to maintain the loyalty of their followers. So they might build alliances, they might do things to kind of appease or reconcile after some conflict, but they are generally have higher social skills than their peers, and they're not always they realize that they have kind of power in that, and they're not always using their skills for good, right? And so an example might be that I noticed with my daughter and her friends was that, you know, if my daughter was trying to kind of befriend someone else, maybe one of her friends, let's call her Rose, Rose would feel jealous, and so at lunch she would give everyone else at the table a cookie except for Iris, right? It's kind of using your social status to be a little bit bullying. Or if Iris was talking to her new friend, Rose would come up and squeeze herself in between them and try to get both of their attention, right? So she's kind of trying to maintain her leadership, her power, by using her social skills. Victims do tend to be more likely to be withdrawn kids, but we also know that bullying can be kind of just these temporary things. Many of us bullied just, you know, for a year or two, or were bullied for a year or two. Bullying does seem to be the worst in middle school, that this kind of transitions are people are more likely to be vying for social status. Boys and girls use actually similar amounts of relational aggression, but boys will also throw in some physical aggression. So when I ask this iClicker in class, lots of students can relate to have been a socially connected bully at some point in their lives. So if we are more consistently bullied, then as we are hearing, you know, that creates some challenging effects over the long term. And you can see this list here. We've had a lot more attention to bullying in recent years because of what the research says about the effects of the long-term effects of bullying, but it can get tricky to figure out what exactly is bullying and what's not. And so, you know, these are challenging situations, you know, so little examples that tactics that elementary school kids might use are, you know, if you're talking to your friends, you can only share your thoughts and feelings, not those of other people, right? So that you're not kind of doing that socially connected bullying or gossiping or that relational aggression. Or before you react to something, think of 6 random things, 6 dinosaurs, 6 TV shows. So just what are the ways that we can, you know, not end up acting like a bully? And so sometimes what I would, you know, say to my kids is, I know you don't intend to be a bully, but some of what you're doing could be perceived as bullying. So in terms of school experiences, individualistic cultures like the US are more likely to think that kids' success in school is due to their innate or biological inborn ability. And also are more likely to kind of tolerate individuality. So we kind of emphasize individual success as compared to, for example, more collectivist cultures like Asian countries that emphasize more obedience, cooperation, this idea that if anyone can obtain success if they work hard enough. Asian countries usually have longer school days and school years. Uniforms, so that we all kind of look the same, are more likely. More of a focus on core studies, less time on art, music, and sports. Okay, so on average, kids in the US use about 3 hours of screens per day, although that number may have changed. The heavier use is correlated with not doing as well in school, increased anxiety, increased social isolation. It's also related to concerns around obesity and aggression. And so as you learned about in your textbook, some Canadian researchers tracked children in towns that before and after they got TV, and found that after TV arrived in town, aggression increased between peers to parents. And so, there is evidence that watching aggressive behavior can increase aggressive behavior. But generally, there's less of a, that the more you kind of use violent videos are going to make you violent, because lots of kids and lots of us as adults can watch violent things and not act violently. But there is a subset of kids who are going to be encouraged to be more violent if they're watching or participating in more violent media. What actually research says on the Mean World Syndrome by Gerber says is actually the more violent TV as adults that you see, the more you are fearful of the world around you rather than being more aggressive for most of us. Okay, so on this multiple choice, victims of bullying are most often rejected, withdrawn children who are low in self-esteem and low in social skills. Okay, so I encourage you to think about social and emotional development and how your parenting practices have changed in your My Virtual Child from preschool through middle childhood, and how what are aspects of your child's behavior and personality that seem continuous from preschool years, and what seems to be different, and what are the challenges that your virtual child is experiencing, and what are you doing about those?